Well, good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here tonight. I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Gabriel Payant. I have a Master of Architecture degree from the Université de Montréal, from the building right next to here. During my master, I was introduced to computational design in general and eventually to iterative design. These are all design process fields, and it's also part of what we call parametric design. So let's just start off by trying to figure out what is what. And so let's head to the disambiguation page. So computational design is a way of envisioning the design process which encompasses the use of data and computation. So it's a bit different from computer-aided drawings that pretty much everyone has heard of, I guess, which is basically using a mouse instead of a pen to draw. By computational design, what we mean is that the use of computer will change and affect for its betterment the design process. So I haven't talked about iterative design yet, so you might wonder what it is. So what is iteration in design in general? So let's forget computer for a second. An iteration in this design is simply the fact that you start off with a design hypothesis. You take into account a lot of things like aesthetics, the user needs, maybe you have a concept behind your project, and you're going to test it through all the constraints that it has to meet. And at some point, one of the constraints might break the design hypothesis. You cannot go further on because you cannot manage to put it all together. So you start over, you change your design hypothesis, and you try it again. And at some point, you're going to pass all the constraints and have a completed project. So it's either a building, or it might be an industrial product. So this is an iteration, and you might make a few of them and end up with a project. So why is it of interest to do iterative design? Before I studied architecture, I was at the UQAM in design, and I had this great professor who's called Koen de Winter. And when he retired, he made a very interesting and inspiring farewell speech. And he would always present like this with 3 concepts at a time that he would put together. Like he would say, to make a great product, you have to take into account consumer needs, the technical capacity to do it, and maybe the cost. And he would give tons of examples. He went on for 40 minutes like this. And what you see is at the crossing of every factor, you get a nice square. You get the box. So I bet you already heard about these 4 words, think outside the box. This is the most overused expression I've ever heard. In the end, you don't know what it means really. And the point of this professor, Koen, was that on the contrary, you have to think the box, you have to master the box, because the box is the bullseye of the design project. If you don't take into account one of these parameters, you're just missing the target. No one's going to buy your product, no one's going to need your product, or no one's going to be able to make it. So if we go back to our design process, we have to take into all these constraints into account. But what happens is with the complexification of systems, always new regulations that you have to apply, you might end up in what I would call the cage. The box is so constrained that you don't know how to go forward. And designers will, in this case, make the blendest project possible because they want to make sure they're going to put it through. Because a great idea that never becomes a project is not a real project. So why is iterative design something of interest for the betterment of humanity? Is that it allows for much more ambitious projects. How does it work? Is that we envision the design process in this way. We have to make first a conceptual model, which is the modeling of all the constraints we know about. So we take them, we make a hierarchy, we weight them, and this gives us really a model. And it is driven by a series of parameters which are our goals or whatever aesthetic conceptual ideas we have. And we run them through the conceptual model, maybe hundreds of times, thousands of times, and each time we register what were the parameters used, and we have a new iteration. So what is this weirdly shaped thing? It's the new box. Like, this is the box defined by all the constraints that were mapped. This is the conceptual model. It's also the landscape of freedom, as I would call, because I know that if my project is anywhere inside this shape, it is already meeting all the constraints. So I can position myself anywhere in this box and be sure it's going to pass through the design process, so I can be much more ambitious. So it could be this box, it could be these box, or it could be one of these 100 generated boxes that were all generated by adding one more constraint each time. And we end up with this really weird looking shape, but this is really the form of freedom to me. So this is how I envision that iterative design can really push better project forwards, because we know from the start that we have everything in hand to make a design project. So with this in mind, I'm going to walk through briefly my thesis project, which made use of iterative design. What was the onset of this project was that in most of North America, but we can see it right here around Montreal, suburban commercial malls are really ailing. So if you go to any of them, except the newer one, you will see that almost half of the rental space is empty. And it is an ongoing problem. It's getting bigger every year because they're making new commercial projects that are very centralized, and for each new project, a lot of the older ones are dying. To be able to make a parametric design process, I had to survey every one. I was on the Taschereau Blvd in Brussels, and I went to every one of them and measured and glanced through the hidden curtain what was for rent, because they usually don't really like that we publish this kind of information. And I made this database of every commercial center with some data, and I was able to put forward an algorithm that would provide a massing for a redevelopment. So I knew what were my goals. I wanted something that could spread to a lot of sites. I wanted something that would allow for people to live on the newly built project, and something that would allow for more local shops to be inserted. These were my goals. I didn't want to do a bland project. I had high standards for the end. So I went with this modeling of constraint, and I knew that the massing I would get would answer a few of these objectives. At first, the algorithm was pretty simplistic, so I would go on and see how much of the superficie, the area was available to, for example, plant trees or make community gardens, then make maybe housing. And in the final onset of the algorithm, I was able to make a massing of what would be habitation. So we went on and we made hundreds of them. I'm only presenting a few to you. And what's really interesting is that in this form finding process, you never really know in advance what you're going to get. You're only sure that you're going to get something that is valuable to your objectives. So you can also get a smiley face without knowing it. And so that's pretty much it. If you want to know more about it, I suggest that you watch for these references. The first one is work from a professor from the Berkeley School. He went on to make an environmental project in San Francisco where he would use easements that were left abandoned to make better air conditions and also for the absorption of water in the ground. If you ever stop by New York, I suggest you go to the Museum of Modern Arts to see Kunde Winter, the professor was talking about, work that is there. If you want to dig deeper in how the design process can be altered by using constraint, you could watch Design Exploration through Bidirectional Modeling of Constraint by Axel Kilian. It's his thesis from the MIT. And if you want to hone your French reading skills, you can have the long version of my thesis project that was published in the online publication La Revue du Cygne Noir. So thank you for your attention, and I really look forward to hear what the other speakers have to say. Thank you.